So after Amanda goes through all the interesting information, we'll be going through the activity that was attached to the email. And just a reminder, if anybody didn't get the email or needs it sent again, you can just put your parents' email in the chat box and we can get that to you after the activity today. And if you haven't printed it out, that's okay. I'm just going to go through the simple steps to put it together, and we're really just going to brainstorm today.
Perfect. All right, well, without further ado then, let's get going. I'm going to share my screen with you guys here. So like I said before, today we're talking about whales and climate change, and I'm going to go through just a few things really briefly so that I know that all of us are on the same page. I was told that schools are doing a pretty good job with talking about climate change, so we won't spend a lot of time here, but I do want everybody that's on the webinar today to know a couple of the terms that I'm going to use when we go through the PowerPoint here. So first is the Salish Sea, and on the next slide I'm going to explain what that is and where it is. The next thing is whales. I'm sure everybody knows what whales are, but I have a picture of two of them at the bottom in case you don't. And then climate change is something that's going to come up over and over again in this talk and was pretty much the basis of why we put this together. So what is the Salish Sea? So I've got a really cool map put together for us here that kind of zooms into the area around Washington and part of Canada that, as you can see by the border, so this big border around the area here, all of this is considered one unique and special place. So I wanted to give you a visual. We had people that said they were joining us from Tacoma, some that had been here from the islands previously. So you guys are kind of right here, almost in the middle. Vancouver, Shoreline, Silverdale, you're all included in this big area of the Salish Sea. And then I'm really glad I took some time to point it out for our Arizona folks, in case you've never been up here before. This is kind of what the whole region looks like. The sea is made up of these big bodies of water that you see here. So we have the Strait of Juan de Fuca, we have the Strait of Georgia, which comes up into Canada, and then we have Puget Sound down here around the Seattle and Tacoma area. And as you can see, based on the border that I pointed out before at the beginning, it doesn't just include the sea itself, those big bodies of water, it also includes all of the river sheds that feed into this area here. And the reason why it's really important to go over that and to include that in the Salish Sea is because it brings a lot of fresh water from the mountains, from snowmelt, from rain that washes down into the sea, and all of the nutrients and really important things that help fuel the bottom of our food chain, which is what attracts larger animals and then eventually whales into this area. So it's really important to understand the relationship between the river sheds and the sea when we talk about the Salish Sea. And we also have two types of whales in the world's oceans. So anywhere you're going to find either toothed whales, which I have down here, whales with teeth, or baleen whales, which is this one right here. And so our toothed whales are, again, whales have teeth. This includes dolphins, porpoises, and all other whales, depending on how we classify them. And from what scientists have discovered and what we know right now, there are 73 known species of toothed whales in the oceans. Now, our baleen whales are also called toothless whales. And instead of teeth, if you notice here in the picture, they have got a series of really fine plates, all kind of stacked up together. And they're lined with hair fixed to that upper jaw. And then they actually use that baleen to filter their food, either from the water or from the sediment, instead of biting and chewing like our toothed whales that have teeth. And from what scientists have discovered and what we know so far, there are 14 known species of baleen whale. And so real quick, I understand a lot of you have probably talked about the difference between climate change and weather, but just to go over it kind of briefly. So weather is basically what the atmosphere is doing right now. So for instance, today it's windy, it's gusty, it's rainy, but I don't know about everybody with where they are. For a little while here, it hasn't been rainy. Like right now, it's just kind of cloudy and windy. So when we talk about weather and people think about weather, we're thinking about maybe how hot or cold it is. So we're talking about temperature. If it's bright outside or cloudy, so sunny or cloudy, windy or not, precipitation, so rain or snow that could be falling, and then visibility. Is it foggy? Is it clear? Is it cloudy? Can you see? Those are the types of things that we talk about when we deal with the weather. And so when we think about weather in that term too, weather can change from minute to minute, meaning that it could be raining and then an hour later it might not be. But now when we talk about climate, on the other hand, it describes a longer term pattern of what weather has been doing in a specific place over a long period of time. So that's why I included this little graph down here. And I actually pulled this from the Bellingham area, since Bellingham was hosting the climate event, to kind of show you what the average high and low temperature is. And they've got the months from January to December down here, and then your degrees here, and just kind of how things change when the seasons progress. So we're looking at a larger period of time, not just an hour or a day or a week. Instead, climate is measured temperature-wise, wind patterns, humidity, snow and rain that happens in a place over years. And it's the average that they take of those different weather or climate phenomena happening over time. So when we talk about the climate changing, what we're looking at is we're taking these things that have been recorded over a long period of time, and we're noticing that there are different climate variables. So maybe it's getting hotter, maybe it's not snowing as much as it used to. And so climate change is pointing out the differences of how the climate has changed, and that likely won't go back to the way that it was before. And so one other important thing that I want to talk about before we get into how climate change impacts our whales is there are two different types of climate change that occur. We have natural climate change, and what I mean by that is the Earth's climate is influenced and slowly changed through natural causes like volcanic eruptions, the ocean current, the way that the Earth orbits the sun. Solar variations, which can include the radiation that's given off by the sun and how that radiation reaches the planet Earth. And then the Earth's core temperature, so I've got a photo down here with kind of the layers sliced out. The temperature changes in the Earth's core, and that can have an effect on how our climate naturally changes. But then the things we really want to focus on are the human-caused climate change part of the talk today. And so Earth's climate is changing even faster than it naturally would, and it's because of some human activities like burning coal, gas, and oil in power plants, and that could be in your cars and planes as well. And it causes heat trapping emissions, so that gas when it's burned, or that oil when it's burned, gives off gases that cause heat to be trapped in our atmosphere. And then we have cutting down and burning forests. Tiny pollution particles emitted into the air can cause the climate to accelerate faster. And then changing the natural land into developing cities or agriculture. So maybe taking a place that used to be covered in trees and instead converting it to some other use. It could be, housing developments. It could be land to raise cattle and different food on, and things like that. So we want to talk about how climate change is affecting the oceans. And so that burning fossil fuels we talked about, and cutting down and burning the forests and the industrial agriculture practices release carbon dioxide and other heat trapping gases into the atmosphere, and that causes the planet to warm more quickly than it would naturally. But the ocean is able to absorb some of what is released into the atmosphere, and more than about 90% of the extra heat and 25% of that CO2 that we talked about is absorbed. But what's happening is it's changing things in the marine environment, and it's causing harm to all of our oceans on the planet. So most of the things that we're seeing changing in the marine environment are that the water itself is becoming warmer. There's less oxygen that's available in the water as well. And then the water is changing its pH balance, meaning that instead of being a very basic water structure, it is more acidic. And we're going to talk about why that's not a really good thing for the marine environment or the marine food chain. So first, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about how climate is affecting our marine ecosystem. We talked about warming water on the last slide. And so the things that are happening because water is warming is we have the polar ice melting. It's causing the sea level to rise. And when the sea level rises, it's actually flooding shorelines, coasts, and wetland habitats. And then it's affecting the migration patterns in some of our forage fish species. So they might not migrate as far as they used to, or their migration might be shortened a little bit. They might not reach the areas that they used to go because those waters are getting warmer. With less oxygen in the water, what we're seeing is some of our fish species and other marine mammals are not getting enough oxygen to breathe. So it's actually causing suffocation in some areas. And then it's also shrinking some marine habitats. And when I say that, basically what I mean is when water is heating up in certain areas, it's pushing the fish and other marine life that would live in those areas to try to find cooler water. So it's not necessarily that the marine habitat is disappearing per se, like it's not there anymore. It's just not an environment that some of these animals or organisms can live in and survive. And then ocean acidification. So when the water gets more acidic, it harms animals that can build shells, for one. So that's corals, clams, oysters, shrimp, anything you can think of that has a hard shell. And then acidic waters are actually impacting phytoplankton, which is the very base of the marine food chain. So what I wanted to ask everybody is how you think a changing ecosystem might affect the food chain. So we didn't go over how to raise your hand, but if you guys have been on our Zoom webinars before, there is a little icon, and Katie, you might be able to describe it to them since I'm screen sharing and I can't see it. But if anybody wants to jump in with an idea of how they think that a changing ecosystem affects the food chain, we would love to hear what you think. So you can put your hand up if you would like to offer any suggestions.
Yeah, and that's just the little hand, and when you light it up, I think it goes blue. Yep, Charlie's got it.
Perfect. Do you have the ability to unmute her?
Yeah, so Charlie, I'm going to unmute you and put your hand down, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Well, is it about the pattern of the food chain?
Yeah, so how do you think that if the ecosystem is changing, and I showed you a couple ways up here. So if the water gets warmer, if there's less oxygen, and if ocean acidification means that the very base of our food chain might be disappearing, how do you think that would affect the rest of the food chain?
Well, then they wouldn't have anything to feed on.
They wouldn't have anything to feed on. That's a great answer.
What I was thinking was, so the food chain, my best guess is there are plankton, and the plankton accidentally eats some litter or some bad stuff floating around in the water. And then a small fish comes by and eats that plankton, and then maybe a salmon comes by and eats the small fish, and then an orca comes by and eats the salmon.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's exactly how the food chain works. And we're going to talk into what might happen if we start missing pieces out of the food chain, what that's going to mean for the rest of the marine environment. So good job. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about. And Charlie was on to something when she was talking about our food chain on a whole. And I'm actually going to show you all an example of the bottom of the food chain and kind of walk through that process. So we have the phytoplankton. They're a little bit different than the zooplankton. Phyto is the plankton that rely on the sun. So they are more plant-based plankton versus zooplankton that is animal-based. So the phyto are actually the very, very, very beginning of the marine food chain here. And then if we hop up a little bit, we've got our forage fish, and then we also have our salmon, as Charlie pointed out. So she already made the connection. And what I want to go over with you all is if phytoplankton are that very first link in the food chain, then they are essentially providing the food resource for every other thing that eats higher up on the food chain. So we're going to talk about what might happen at the next step if our phytoplankton start disappearing. And forage fish, kind of being that next link that is the jump after both phyto and zooplankton, provide food for other animals, fish, birds, so smaller marine animals and birds in the marine environment. So if forage fish populations start to disappear, then there's going to be some pretty profound effects on the next link in the food chain. And then salmon actually play this amazing role because not only are they feeding some of our larger marine mammals, like Charlie mentioned, our orcas, but there are also a lot of other species that depend on salmon that don't necessarily live in the marine environment. Some of them are birds of prey like eagles, some of them are bears and wolves up on the coast of Vancouver Island. And then you have to factor us into the equation too, because there are a lot of people that eat fish. So then now we're not just looking at the marine food chain anymore, we're starting to look at the terrestrial or the people and animals that live on the earth. We're looking at our food chain too. So if you guys had to guess out of these three that I have on the screen, what do you think is whale food? What out of these three links in the food chain do you guys think is whale food? So I think I see a hand up with Elsie, if you want to go. You want to tell me?
Salmon.
Salmon, so that's a good one. Perfect. Does anybody else think phytoplankton or forage fish might be food for whales as well? Charlie, you had your hand up at one. Yeah, go ahead and unmute yourself. What do you think?
Well, I'm kind of thinking the plankton.
Okay, that's a really good guess too. And then Jackson, I saw your hand up. Do you agree with these girls? Do you have any other thoughts on what whale food might be?
Yeah, like wouldn't everything be whale food?
Would what?
Everything be whale food? Like
Yeah.
Forage fish, plankton.
Yep, so you're absolutely right. All three of what's on the screen here are a very, very important part of feeding our whales. So good job. Thank you for that. So if climate change is affecting the ocean and the marine ecosystem and the food chain, then it's definitely affecting our whales, right? And not just some whales, it's actually affecting all of them. But since we don't have time to talk about all 87 species that I pointed out between our toothed whales and our baleen whales, I wanted to take the time to talk about two populations that use the Salish Sea, and they're using it to find food, and what climate change is doing to the food and how it's going to affect them in the long term here. So the two that I have circled right now are our killer whales and our gray whales. So I want to start off with our southern resident orcas. And actually here in the Salish Sea, we have two unique communities of orca that use the Salish Sea to find food. We have our Biggs orcas, which eat marine mammals, and then we have our southern resident orcas. And the reason that these communities are unique within the orca species is because there are no other orca populations quite like the two that we have here. Our southern residents are fish eaters. Again, our Biggs are marine mammal eaters, and that happens in some other places around the world. But they talk differently, they speak different dialects than maybe orcas that are in the Arctic or in New Zealand, for instance. So it's really kind of cool to have these two unique communities here. And with the southern residents being fish-eating orcas, they're relying primarily on salmon to survive. Most importantly, Chinook salmon, which makes up about 80% of their diet. Unfortunately, what's going on with the southern residents here is that they're endangered. There are 73 left of these whales in the wild. And while there are other factors that are causing the orcas some stress, the biggest problem for them is the lack of salmon. So that's the biggest threat that they face. So if we get into southern residents and climate change is potentially going to make things worse for southern residents because the salmon species that they rely on are really, really impacted by just a few degrees difference in the water temperature. So they really need cold, clean water with a lot of oxygen in it in order to survive. So when the water heats up by a couple of degrees, here are some of the things that are happening. That oxygen is going to be reduced. Heat actually speeds up the metabolism for salmon. And what happens is it causes the salmon to burn through their energy reserves faster than if they were traveling in cold water. And when that is really, really dangerous for salmon is when they are migrating from either the ocean into the streams so that they can spawn, or when they've been hatched and they've grown big enough that they're ready to out-migrate from the river to the ocean. It takes a lot of energy, and they're really trying to get from one place to the next as quickly as possible. So if they're spending a lot of this energy migrating already, then their metabolism speeding up, causing them to burn more energy, can actually kill them prematurely. And then warm water also makes salmon more vulnerable to some parasites that live in the marine environment, and then they're susceptible to diseases as well. So the other thing about water getting hotter is salmon are going to have a harder time surviving, and their populations are going to continue to decline. We already have a lot of our salmon species in the region and all along the coast. We've seen numbers drop. Some of our salmon species are threatened, and some of them are considered endangered as well. So this could be potentially, a really negative impact to what remains of our wild salmon stocks. So if there's a decrease in the things that southern residents eat, then there's definitely going to be a decrease in the orca population as well. Meaning if salmon keep declining, then sadly, so will our southern residents. So that's kind of the big takeaway here for climate change with the resident orcas, is it's really, really going to affect their food source. And then our gray whales here, what's really cool about gray whales is around 2001 was the last time that an average was taken on how many they thought were in the entire population as a whole. There were believed to be about 26,000 individuals in the ocean. But there's a very special group of grays, between about 12 and 14 individuals that we call the sounders, and they visit the Salish Sea in the springtime. And what they're doing is they're looking for food here. They make this huge migration down to warm water to breed and have babies. And after they make that migration down to warmer water, they don't eat the entire time that they're there. So when they're making their migration back north, a lot of whales are hungry, and a few of them have figured out if they make a pit stop and a little detour into the Salish Sea here, that there's actually some food that they have found in Saratoga Passage, which if you were to look at us on a map, we have Whidbey Island and Camano Island. So it's the body of water that's located between those two islands there. Gray whales are actually bottom feeders, and they use their baleen, like I've got here in the picture, to filter through the mud, and they're looking for ghost shrimp that burrow in the sand and kind of live down in that mud. So unfortunately too, kind of what's going on with the gray whales is in the last couple of years, we have seen a mass die-off of some of the individuals in this population. And it's called an unusual mortality event. So it's just this big event where we don't really know why, and scientists have to research to try to figure out what's causing our gray whales to die before, it's time. So we're still trying to figure out what is causing the unusual mortality event for the last 2 years. And then most of the animals that have been found when they do wash on shore, scientists were finding that they weren't getting enough food. They seemed really skinny. When they were doing a necropsy, which is where they perform kind of a surgery to explore to see what's going on with the animal that passed away, finding their stomachs were empty. So we can definitely say that it has something to do with their food. So when we talk about gray whales and climate change again, what we're looking at is that climate change is likely to make things harder on gray whales. Rising temperatures and ocean acidification is going to change the way the ecosystem works, and then the way that their prey is capable of surviving in that ecosystem as well. So when water warms here, what we're looking at is we do have polar ice melting, and that's going to cause sea level to rise, like I mentioned before. And what it can do is eliminate the shoreline habitat, which is a really important area for gray whales. So they're not just finding deep water and diving down to sift through the mud there. They actually wait for high tide to come in, and they feed along kind of the shoreline area where those shrimp are burrowed down. So if the shoreline habitat gets completely eliminated by the water rising, that could potentially be a problem for ghost shrimp. That's going to be a change in their ecosystem, in their environment, where they might not be able to find ground high enough to continue to burrow down. And that could cause a very sharp decline with the gray whale population. And then if we look back at ocean acidification, these little ghost shrimp do actually molt the outer layer, or their shells, as they get bigger. And that shell is kind of a defense mechanism for them. And so ocean acidification could cause harm to that outer shell, and it might not even give them the ability to continue creating the shell that they live in. So those are two things that we're looking at that could cause some problems, as well as kind of circling back to phytoplankton. So if phytoplankton are really impacted by ocean acidification on a whole, then those ghost shrimp might not even have the food source that they need, which could cause a decline there as well. So Charlie, do you have a question?
Well, my school used to raise salmon eggs.
Yeah.
So couldn't people raise salmon eggs and then properly take care of them with what they would eat in the wild, and then release them into the wild?
They might.
And wouldn't the orcas have an easier time?
That's something that scientists have been looking at recently, yeah. But then if we release salmon into the ocean and the ocean is too warm, do you think that they'll survive?
Well, you'd have to release them into a cold area.
Yeah, and then we would have to hope that the southern residents could figure out where that cold area was, right? Yeah. So it's kind of a complex problem, right?
Well, what about their echolocation?
Yep. So their echolocation is exactly how they find food. It would just be a matter of, I guess, them finding it. You know, if we have to go further north where the water is cooler to release salmon, there are actually some other fish-eating orcas that live up near Alaska. We have northern residents that like the northern end of Vancouver Island, so they might actually get that salmon first before the southern residents, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Well,
all right.
What if someone waited till enough days where they'd get there and they'd arrive the day before, a day where the orcas would get to Vancouver Island?
Yeah.
They'd wait till they saw the orcas, then they'd very carefully put down the salmon and then hide behind some trees, carefully of bears and wolves, and see so the orcas wouldn't just come around and go off living off humans.
Yeah.
And then they'd try to see if the orcas would get the salmon.
Yeah. Well, I would love to test that theory because I really want to get the southern residents more food. So maybe you and I should talk after this.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, circling back to gray whales, the same graphic here that I kind of had up for the southern residents. If there is a decrease in what the whales are eating, we're already actually seeing, some of it. And I don't know if scientists can definitively say without a doubt that climate change is what's causing our unusual mortality event right now, but they are very much considering that the habitat that these ghost shrimp live in is changing and could likely be the reason why we're seeing a decrease in gray whales. So again, if ghost shrimp sharply decline, then the gray whales that rely on them for food to survive are also going to decline. The question for everybody on the webinar today is, what can we do to slow down human-made climate change and help all of the whales? I know we only talked about gray whales and southern residents, and we love them dearly. I don't know about everybody else, but I love all the whales out in the ocean too. So I want to try to find some ways that we think we can help all of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to stick around for the kids activity, and we're going to brainstorm a little bit and try to figure out what some things are you think we can do to try to slow down the human-made side of climate change. But before we do that, I wanted to ask if anybody had any questions. Do you have questions about weather versus climate or anything that I covered, anything on the southern residents or the gray whales? I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Charlie, you have a question?
Can you very quickly list the name of each food for, like, if you go through some of the other whales you didn't talk about today?
Yeah, that's actually a great idea. So some of the other whales that we have that come into the Salish Sea, we have humpbacks that like to visit us in the summertime. Sometimes they stay through early fall, and then they might make a migration too for warmer water, looking to go for breeding and to give birth to their babies. But while they're here, some of the things that they're eating are plankton or krill, so two very teeny tiny little things that live in the ocean. And then it's thought maybe some herring, so some forage fish as well. And they're baleen whales, but they feed a little bit differently than gray whales. So if grays feed along the bottom, humpbacks actually open their mouth really wide in the water and just kind of cruise around until their throat is full. They shut their mouth, and with their tongue, they force all of the water out through the baleen, and whatever sticks in that filtration system, they go back through with their tongue and kind of lick everything off and then swallow. So krill, plankton, herring. We have another little baleen whale that visits the Salish Sea that not a lot of people are familiar with. They're called minke whales. They're a little bit bigger than our orcas. They have a very small hooked dorsal fin that kind of reminds me a little bit of a dolphin. And they're very, very, very shy. It is very hard to see a minke. They like some of the areas out in deeper water that will help some of the fish come up more toward the surface. And so herring and anchovy and things like that are what they're looking to round up here too. So mainly forage fish for those guys. And then if we talk about two of our smaller species here, we have two different types of porpoise. We have our little harbor porpoise, which a lot of people see when they're on Washington State ferries or they're in marinas or at parks, parks near the water. They're about 5.5 to 6 feet long, so they are very small. And they're looking for the same little forage fish that are out there, as well as our Dall's porpoise as well. So I would say those are the main type that we get here. Not that we don't have sightings of some other whales from time to time. It's just not as common. And then like I said, there are 87 species that we know of either toothed or baleen whales in the ocean, but those are the ones that we get here around the Salish Sea. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Perfect. So now that kind of helps you. I'm glad you asked that, because we talked about the bottom of the food chain and all of it being whale food. So now you know that humpbacks do rely on that plankton and forage fish, as well as our minke whales.
And then it looks like we have a question. I think it was Jason.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This may be a dumb question, but for the Southland residents, because they primarily feed on like Chinook salmon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there another species that they feed on? Like, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with like salmon and how they like swim upstream. But is there like a time during the year where salmon is not really an accessible food source?
Yes, so that's a great question. So we have that, getting back to kind of that Salish Sea map and looking at all the different river sheds that feed directly into the Salish Sea. There are some main rivers that Chinook and chum and sockeye, coho, different salmon will come back to. And it's not just that Chinook will come in and migrate in the summer and that's it. Certain rivers might have like a fall run that occurs. They might have a run that occur in the springtime. In the wintertime is when we see southern residents moving off the coast of Washington. So they're out in open ocean water. A little bit of what we know about where they go is they've been seen at the mouth of the Columbia River, which is the river that's kind of that state boundary line between Washington and Oregon. Used to be a big river for production of salmon at different times of the year and for different salmon species, but has since kind of been impeded by the construction of different series of dams along the Columbia River and the Snake, which is further in. Gray's Harbor, which is a little bit further down, has passage where salmon are kind of coming and going in the Chehalis River Basin down there. And then they've been seen as far south as Monterey Bay in California. So we're thinking the Klamath along California that's getting ready to undergo the process of removing a couple of those dams down there might actually help put some more food into the water off the coast in the wintertime when things are a little bit leaner for them. And the other thing that we've seen happen in the wintertime is instead of just relying on Chinook, chum salmon is supplemented. They will eat lingcod and halibut. Sockeye finally started showing up as about 1% of their winter diet in the last couple of years, and we figure that's probably supplementing something else that they might not be getting or have access to. And then there will be certain areas that will still have adult Chinook salmon out there, but it's definitely more widely variable in the wintertime. And it did actually take tagging, satellite tagging, some of the southern residents a few years ago for a few years to gather data to kind of figure out where they were going and making some educated guesses on what river sheds they're probably relying on when they're not here. So that was a great question.
Oh, thank you for answering.
Yeah. All right, well, if nobody else has any questions, I'm going to turn everything over to Katie, and she's going to talk with you guys a little bit about the activity. So is everybody ready? Oh, I see some more hands. How about the girls?
We have a question about the resident orcas. How many resident orcas do you know are there?
There are 73 right now. And what's really cool is today is what, the 23rd. If I were to have told you 20 days ago, I would have had to have said 72. So we had a birth in the southern resident community very recently that has a lot of us very, very excited and very happy.
Do you know how the babies are doing? Or baby, sorry.
Yeah, so far really good. He's still been with mom, and we just found out yesterday through some photos that the baby's a boy. So we were excited to hear that today too.
That's so cute.
Yeah.
We've, as a group, have been enjoying this book. Do you know any background of this book, The Whale of the Wild?
I don't. I have not heard of that book. Who's the author?
It is Roseanne Parry, looks like, but it's about the resident orcas, and talks about the past, and it talks a lot about the resident orcas, and it's written from the whale's point of view. It's fantastic, but I was just wondering if you knew any backstory on it, because it's so local.
Yeah. Huh. I don't, but now I'm going to have something that I can do some homework on. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. Those are our questions.
Definitely. All right. Well, Katie, if you want to talk about the activity.
Sounds good. So first off, if you didn't have time to print it off or you don't have it with you, just grab a pencil and paper or a pen and paper, just so you can jot your ideas down. And then I'm just going to go real quick, just in case it was confusing at all, through each piece so you know how to assemble it. Ooh, nice job. I can see that, Elsie. So this is the one that goes on the bottom, the one that says the Salish Sea. So you're going to put that down first. And then you would glue around the edge, only the edges though, so you don't stick your flaps down. And then the second one that goes down is the one that looks like the US map, this one. And I should have backed up a little bit more. You should have cut these flaps out just from the center to the outside. Don't cut all the way though. And then you glue that one down, and then you would put glue around the edge of that one. And the last one that goes on top is the world map. And you would have done the same thing where you poked a hole in the middle and cut out almost to the edge. And you glue that one down on top. So what you're left with is this little guy who's got two mouths, an inside mouth and an outside mouth. Looks like most everybody got this done already. Nice work. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, we're going to brainstorm ideas about what to put on each one. We'll start on the very outside with the world, with our world. So you can write anywhere on the white spaces around this one, since you've already got the flaps on top. And I just want to see if anybody had any ideas of their own. So you have the ideas we gave you, which were on the legend.
I can share the screen so that that's up if you want me to.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to be able to be sure to see theirs, but yeah.
Yeah, so these were the 3 pages you were just talking about. So planet Earth, the United States, and then Salish Sea kind of at the bottom. And then I can leave it on list of suggested actions if you want.
That sounds good.
Okay, just for a few minutes, and then we'll definitely let everybody show us their completed projects.
Sounds good. So I wanted to make sure, oh, okay. We had one chat, but I wanted to make sure if anybody had any of their own ideas that they added to this list, I would love to see what you have. So for the world, did anybody have any thoughts about things that we can do? So suggested actions that we can do to help reduce the speed of climate change. So what we have on here are things like reduce the use of fossil fuels, fly or travel less, which actually is happening a lot with COVID anyway. Not wasting the food that you buy, eating more plant-based meals, which could even be like a lot of people just start with meatless Mondays and they go from there. Even just eating one less meal of meat a week can make a huge impact. Buy less. I see any hands. Don't be shy about sharing your ideas. It's probably something that none of us have thought about. Anybody? Well, if nobody had any world ideas that they wanted to share, can somebody tell me which one that they maybe picked to put on theirs, even if it's from the list? Ooh, the girls are having a snack.
Yeah.
That's one thing I miss about our in-person youth activities is the snack part.
They're eating plant-based right now.
Right?
Yeah. All right, maybe by a show of hands. So who has ever done a meatless Monday before or tried something that was meat-free? Anybody? I'm actually making chili tonight with that Impossible beef. So yeah, very cool. Yep, sun chips.
Sun chips. Somebody has their hand up. Did you have something? I can't remember. Elizabeth, who are we looking at?
This is Steven.
Hey, Steven.
Do you have something to say?
Mm,
He's still thinking about it.
Oh, yeah. And maybe we just need a little bit more time to wet our noodles, right?
Yeah, it's going to get easier. It's really hard to think about the whole world and what one thing you can do to try to affect the entire world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, then let's go to the United States. What could we do right here in our own country? Does anybody have any thoughts or one that you picked from the list that you thought was really important to share?
Oh, Hazel.
There we go.
Yep.
Go ahead, Hazel.
So like if your gas things that you use break down, like replace them with electric things.
That's a really good idea.
The same kind of could go for maybe your light bulbs as they burn out, putting in LED or really efficient ones. Because you don't have to make huge major changes all at once. You could make them slowly and they add up to big change.
All right, and the girls have their hand raised too.
Oh, the girls, go for it.
You could like ride your bike or walk to a walkable place instead of driving a car, or you could also take the bus if you need to go
Definitely.
instead of using a car.
I love that.
Really good one. Because of COVID right now, we didn't include ride sharing because we have a feeling a lot of people aren't doing that. But that's a really, really good one too. And then I think Charlie had her hand up too.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Don't buy plastic bags at the store.
That's a great one.
Definitely.
Elsie, I see a hand up.
Don't go fishing as much.
Don't go fishing as much. That's a great thought.
All right, and then Steven had his hand up too.
Yeah.
You can use solar panel cars.
Ooh,
I love that.
that's a big idea.
Solar panel, all of it.
I think I saw another hand up in the girls.
Yeah.
You could ask for no plastic straws when you go to a restaurant.
And also recycle.
That's perfect. So not only are you guys able to reduce plastic waste, but if you think about it, it takes energy to actually create those things, right? So we talked about how oil is burned or coal is burned. Those are all things that are needed in order to create things in big factories, right? It requires a lot of energy to make those things. So anytime you can find something reusable, that's a really, really, really good alternative, not just because we're not going to throw it away and make the trash problem even bigger, but because we're going to save the energy that it takes to make those items too.
Also, if you do go fishing, you should do catch and release instead of keeping the fish.
There you go. All right, and Steven, you have another one?
You can maybe make it trickier for companies to make the all the plastic bottles and plastic bags.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that.
Kind of tell them we don't want them anymore, right? That's a really good idea.
That's another thing that happens when we use less plastic too. They make less plastic things.
Yes. Awesome.
Anybody else? I just learned this year how much waste we use with our clothing because we buy so much new clothing. So that was a new one for me. So hand-me-downs or going to the thrift store. That's another thing we can do.
Definitely.
All right, well, what about the Salish Sea? What can we do in our home around here? Well, not all of our homes. Some of us are from Arizona and Germany. But what can we do in the Salish Sea?
All right, girls, you got a good one?
You can use, well, we already said use less plastic baggies, but you can also, if you don't need like something new from the store, then you don't really need it because it takes like oil and stuff to make it. And then, I think that was it.
Yeah.
That was great. Great idea. I know we kind of have a problem around here with our wastewater runoff too. But that's more of our parents need to be on top of our septic systems and cleaning up our yards and stuff like that.
Yep, but even using less water in particular, that's another thing, you know, it's got to go back to some of those wastewater treatment plants, and that takes a lot of energy to try to pull things that shouldn't be in the water out of the water. So that was one of our items on the list here was, you know, one simple thing you could do is just turn the water off when you're brushing your teeth. If you're going to stand there for 2 minutes and brush, you don't need the water that's running anyway. So that's a great small thing that somebody can do locally that will help with the communities and the energy that we're using to get the water cleaned again.
I have one on that note, and it is talk to your parents or your older siblings who drive to wash their cars at car washes so the water runs off and gets filtered out and also isn't wasted. So
that's a great one.
Totally along those lines. Thanks.
Perfect. All right, so who leaves certain things plugged in when they're done using them? Have you guys thought about that? Like even your phone chargers or maybe the charger for your tablet or anything you're using for school that needs electricity. If you were to pull that plug out of the wall when you're not charging your electronics, that can actually help reduce the energy that your house uses too. And then girls, you had your hand up again. You have another one?
Yeah, I could that. When we were in school, there was also you could do recycling team and green team, and so you had to like help sort the recycling and make sure the compost goes in the right places. And doing that would probably be very important.
Nice.
Definitely.
So what do you guys think? Do you think that a good action, especially for around here in the Salish Sea, would be to teach others about what you learned today about how climate is affecting the whales' food? Yeah, because not a lot of people know that, right? I'm sure you talk about climate change in school quite a bit on maybe a bigger level on how it's impacting humans. But I'm curious, maybe let's do a show of hands. Has anybody talked about how climate change is affecting whales or the ocean or the animals or anybody else? Yeah, a little bit. Not so much. So is this a new topic for almost everybody today? Well, that's really cool. I'm glad we could share it with you a little bit. Girls, do you have a question or a comment, or were you just saying that today was kind of new for you?
Today was kind of new for us.
So.
Well, good. Yeah, one thing that can be really, really beneficial is to share your knowledge with anybody that you know, because maybe they didn't know that our whales that are already kind of going through a hard time here are going to be impacted even more by, the water heating up and becoming more acidic and running out of oxygen there. There's a lot of things that are happening in the ocean that's going to affect everything that lives there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Katie, do you have anything else for the activity?
I don't think so. So if you hadn't already, you can take the ideas that you thought of today and fill out the rest of your thing, and maybe just put it up on your fridge for the month to remind yourself to do some of these things. Or talk to mom and dad about what you learned today, or aunts and uncles, or friends that you talk to over Zoom.
And anyone that finished theirs, I'd like to see you show them to us.
Yeah.
Nice job.
Those are awesome.
I know, I love them. You guys did
Good
such
job.
a great
Good job, Elsie. Good job, Charlie. Very good.
April's got one. That's awesome.
You all did it.
Judah's got
Judah,
one.
good.
Hi, Judah. You snuck in on us after we started, huh?
Good.
Hazel's got a nice one.
Yes.
Good job. And you can use those to teach others, your friends and family. More people that are aware, the better we can solve this problem. Good job.
It's like a ripple. If you tell one person and they tell one person.
Well, awesome. Well, guys, thanks for joining us today. We hope that everybody learned something and had fun. You guys had great ideas. I'm actually going to steal a few and write them down so that we can suggest them in the future. If nobody else has any questions, we're going to do a youth activity again next month. And we're talking about maybe doing the salmon life cycle and talking about all those animals that I mentioned rely on salmon as a food source. So October, it's kind of unofficial, but we refer to October as Orca Salmon Month. So it would be really fun to kind of talk a little bit about salmon. And some of you might have been with us at the Langley Whale Center last year when I did Orca Salmon. But if not, I have to figure out how to do it a little differently now that we can't be in person anyway. So come back and join us. All right, any last questions, or you guys are free to go if not? No?
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
We'll see you next month.
Everybody.
Thank
Thank you for spending the afternoon with us.
Bye.
Bye.